Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is September 29th, 2023, and I'm delighted to be here with Rebecca Ruth Gould. Hello, Rebecca.
Hi, Laura. It's great to be here.
So let me do a brief introduction and we will get right into it. Rebecca is distinguished professor of comparative poetics, yes, and global politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. She is also an accomplished author. Her latest book is entitled Erasing Palestine, Free Speech and Palestinian Freedom. It was published earlier this summer in July 2023, and that's really the focus of our conversation today, or the hook, I should say, for our conversation today. Rebecca's other books include the Persian prison poem, Sovereignty and the Political Imagination, which is Edinburgh University Press 2021, and Writers and Rebels, the Literature of Insurgency in the Caucasus, which is Yale University Press in 2016. She has also written on the challenges of defining anti-Semitism and respecting free speech for Prospect Magazine, Political Quarterly, The New Arab, Middle East Eye, and others. And I should just add very quickly, we're going to be referencing pretty much all of those articles and your book, and maybe a couple studies in the course of today's podcast. And I will include notes to all of those things with this podcast. So people don't need to worry about following along. They'll be able to click right through when we get to it. So welcome again. As I said, the hook for our conversation today is your book. And I think maybe the place to start, rather than addressing the book directly, is you. Maybe you could introduce yourself and briefly talk about your personal story, which is sort of the kernel of the book, and talk about how you and your work became inextricably entangled in the battle over free speech and Palestinian freedom.
Absolutely. So I think the story begins in 2012 when I was a postdoctoral fellow. I'd just gotten my PhD. I was postdoctoral fellow at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. However, I was living in Bethlehem and for about a year. And really, it was a kind of crash course in the occupation, going through checkpoints all the time. And yeah, I learned a lot. And I became at a certain point, it was actually a 5-year position, but I stayed there a year because it was this sort of schizophrenic world that I kind of couldn't continue living there anymore. But before I left, I wrote this brief article called Beyond Antisemitism, which was maybe like my book in some ways too, kind of written from a very personal perspective about my frustration with the occupation, with this sort of schizophrenic divided world that Israelis were living in, not seeing what was happening just a few feet away from them. And I published that, and I really moved on to other things in life. In fact, I didn't see myself as someone who was necessarily specializing in Palestine, just as someone who lived there. I moved on to other things. I got a job at the University of Bristol, and this was started in 2016. That was actually turned out to be a very important year or 2015, sorry. But yeah, the 2016, soon after, was an important year in the history of the anti-Semitism's entanglement with Palestinian activism, because that was the year that the UK government was the first country to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism under Theresa May. I, of course, at this time wasn't paying attention to it, but it did come to affect me directly, because a student in one of my classes found this article that I'd mentioned, Beyond Antisemitism, and arranged to make a publicity around it. He published an article in the student newspaper saying that, in his view, it was anti-Semitic because of its criticism of Israel. And the government became involved in a certain sense, not at least certain politicians became involved. The right-wing newspapers like the Daily Telegraph published a story. And it was really interesting. I mean, I wasn't kind of planning on this happening in my life. I'd really moved on to other things. But I was sort of brought back to this moment of my writing the article and why I wrote the article. And if anything, the situation had gotten much worse, since I'd left. So it wasn't a case of me. Everyone wanted me to, I mean, these people wanted me to retract, obviously. That would have been a great publicity coup for them. But that was not conceivable for me. And initially, within the kind of university context, I think everyone was pretty clear. I mean, not the people who were accusing me, but sort of the administrators, colleagues, and so forth, even the lawyer for the University of Bristol, were pretty clear that it was not, the article was not a big deal, but when it was fine, you know, had nothing to worry about. But then when the government became involved, when there was an official complaint against me by a group called the Campaign Against Antisemitism, and they wouldn't let the issue go. And so then an investigation was launched into the article. Again, keep in mind, this is something I wrote in 2012. I had never set foot in the UK at that point, so it would seem kind of irrelevant, but there was enough pressure that something had to be done. So I got
Rebecca, just to be clear, the complaints against you for the article are entirely grounded in this, what was at that point a relatively new definition of anti-Semitism that was being promoted. It isn't arguing that there is what we think of as the classical sense of anti-Semitism, hatred and prejudice and discrimination or incitement against Jews because they are Jewish. This was based on a newly promoted redefinition of anti-Semitism that refocuses on Israel.
That's completely true. And I think that, the timing is absolutely crucial. That's why it is more, as much, I think, of a historical story as a personal one, because yes, the timing was very important. It was, on the one hand, actually coincided with Israel Apartheid Week, and with the adoption of the IHRA definition. We should add, I mean, just to be a little bit technical, I suppose, it's in the sense that this thing that's called the IHRA definition is a minor revision of a previous definition called the EUMC definition, which never attained the same level of kind of political visibility. But so in that sense, it's not entirely new, but it's new in the sense of its political recognition that it was receiving.
Right. And I should say for folks who are listening, if you are a follower of Occupied Thoughts, you know that we have done many podcasts and webinars, and we have our own research online accessible to the public on IHRA and its history, including an incredibly long and I would say almost exhaustively documented report that I just published on the history of the definition. What's striking for me, though, is it's sort of coming at you after the fact. Like you wrote something before this campaign started, and then they came to get you with it, which is, I think, it's quite striking. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Precisely. No, I think that's a really important, I mean, that's kind of the point of the book too, is to place it historically, because yes, there have been, and even in the US, it wasn't like necessarily a new thing for Palestinian professors to be accused of anti-Semitism, but in the UK it was a new moment. The IHRA definition, or any kind of definition of anti-Semitism, actually had not been used in that way against an academic ever in a UK university context. And actually, I think before my arrival, there was actually a lot more freedom around what one could say about Palestine. So yes, so this was a really, and I that's what made it kind of so surreal, because I think if this had happened 3 years earlier, there would have been nothing for the university to do. There would have been no the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and that was referenced by politicians who commented, by the student, and so it was in a sense inevitable that there was going to be this investigation. And so that's where I realized, like, I actually had to educate myself on what was going on, what changes were happening. In fact, a colleague did kind of alert me to that. In fact, back when we thought it was not really a big deal, the student's complaint, because initially the student made a complaint but didn't kind of go forward with it, but then a bigger organization took it on. Just the mere fact that they did mention this EUMC definition was kind of the giveaway that it wasn't just about me, that there was something else happening. And that colleague who told me that was completely right. And so then, yes, and then actually very soon after, right around the time that this investigation about my article was underway, Joe Johnson, the Minister of Education, circulated a letter to all UK universities telling them that they had to adopt the IHRA definition. So the government, was not taking a neutral stance at all. They were saying that it's time to kind of crack down on all of this anti-apartheid activism that's been flourishing on UK university campuses. So yeah, at the end of that, I mean, the investigation concluded that everything was fine. But the fact that, I went for 6 months, I went on medical leave, I had a lawyer, I was kind of done with the university by that point. It really made me feel, and I was, all along I was told that I really shouldn't say anything, shouldn't speak out. So even, I think what that shows you is that, even if you are quote unquote vindicated, and it doesn't mean everything's fine. You're still silenced. You're still pressured to not say anything ever again.
Yeah, and you cover this, I think, really beautifully in the book, and the broader impacts, the chilling effect, the self-censorship, the next generation looking up, particularly next generation of scholars, of course, in the US with tenure and the fear of not getting tenure. So actually, I'm gonna zoom back in on you and your personal story. I want to zoom out for a second, and draw to people's attention a report that came out, I think last week, a week before, from the European Legal Support Center, which is, by the way, it's funded by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. We love them, and the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies. It was a report called "Freedom of Speech and Academic Freedom in UK Higher Education: The Adverse Impact of the IHRA Definition of Anti-Semitism." And I will say that this is a really powerful report, and it is mercifully brief in terms of, it's not like hundreds of pages. You can get through it. It also offers a response for those of us who've been warning of the dangers of this politicized definition of anti-Semitism. And the answer you often get is, well, can you show how where it's ever had that effect? Which I think is kind of hilarious. It's like you warning people, like, if you don't put a warning on it, people will die on this, people will get sick when they eat it. And like, well, we're gonna have to wait and see if people eat it and get sick. Maybe no one will eat it. And it's like, yes, but the people pushing it are like, we're going to make you eat it. That's the whole point. I'm sorry, that may be a bad analogy, but it's really, it's useful to have this report actually showing harm. Yeah. And the summary of that report states, I'm just going to read really briefly, quote, "This report demonstrates that accusations of anti-Semitism leveled against students and staff in UK universities are often based on a definition of anti-Semitism, IHRA, that is not fit for purpose, and in practice is undercutting academic freedom and the rights to lawful speech of students and staff, and causing harm to the reputations and careers of those accused." So they have anonymized all of the details of their cases to protect the innocent. I'm sure names have been changed to protect the innocent, but it's pretty clear that you're one of those cases, if not maybe the case. So I wanted to ask you to talk about the report, and just sort of zooming out, what you see as an academic in the UK, and you've obviously been following this since day one, since you're at the center of it. What is happening?
Sure. Yeah, so I do want to recommend that report to anyone interested in this issue who cares about it. I think it is a fabulous document. I think what makes it very powerful, precisely as you said, is that it helps us put a kind of, makes tactile the question of censorship and silencing, which is very hard to measure and quantify. And it does that through these very powerful testimonials. Another point that I think is really fabulous about it is the way that it captures like the impact on contingent staff. And there's people with part-time work who don't necessarily have permanent positions, and the disproportionate impact it has on Palestinian students and staff. In terms,
if I could just add, one of the things that's surreal about having to demonstrate all this is that the people promoting it are quite clear. This is the intended impact. It's a feature, that is the feature, not a bug. But then those of us who are warning of the danger are being told, well, you can't, unless you can demonstrate impact it. Okay, so I'm sorry, go on.
Right. So I think one of the most, like, one thing just from the part that you read that is worth dwelling on is this not fit for purpose. So that makes us think, okay, like, what is the purpose? What would be fit for purpose? I think the first thing, and it's really worthwhile to kind of critique the concept of anti-Semitism that's embedded in this IHRA definition. But I think even kind of before we get there, even before we look at what it's the content, look at like the way that it's presented as this thing that if you adopt, you're suddenly free, an institution suddenly like purifies itself of racism as a kind of tool, right? I think that really needs to be questioned and interrogated. One of the big problems, with the definition is that it makes a political statement about, what It means anti-Zionism being potentially anti-Semitic, right? I would say like people have the right to hold that opinion, but it is an opinion. And so to embed that within a definition that's supposed to be objective and neutral is a real disaster. So it's and the definition itself is also just muddled and unclear. So it doesn't, none of what it says, I just think there's a real mismatch between like what it is as a document and what it says it's supposed to do. So the fact that it just isn't fit for purpose creates, I think it opens the space for kind of bureaucratic abuse and a lot of hypocrisy in an administrative context, right? So even before we get to the content, just it's not a good definition. It doesn't capture anti-Semitism. So yeah, it becomes a box ticking exercise that can kind of help to mediate whatever bureaucratic agenda the university needs to protect itself. And I think kind of a way of what I see happening. I mean, to be concrete, like I'm speaking from what I see happening, for example, at the University of Bristol, or other UK universities, of course. But if they need to demonstrate, once you have this definition, and groups are asking, well, how have you shown that you've eradicated anti-Semitism? Well, the answer to that question, is that, we've adopted this definition, this IHRA definition. That's a distraction from both anti-Semitism and any other kind of social justice activism.
And interesting, that's a point that Ken Stern has made numerous times.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's almost as if, you have students who are rallying around this, Jewish students told like, this is what you need to rally around. When it's not like adopting this doesn't make white supremacist,
right,
neo-Nazis, anti-Semites disappear. It does allow groups who want to shut down a certain kind of free speech and academia shut it down more easily. It doesn't actually target anti-Semitism. And I will say, I mentioned to you when we got on the call, I just got off, I listened to on X, there was a Spaces conversation between Elon Musk and a lot of right-wing Jewish figures. And listening to that Spaces, one gets the sense that what they're trying to say to Elon Musk is, if you adopt IHRA, people will stop worrying about you being an anti-Semite, and then you can shut down left-wing free speech, which, anti-woke, and then the rest of it isn't a problem. It's just kind of surreal given what's happening today. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we should look at that word adopt as much as we should look at its hugely problematic content of the definition. That makes it not fit for purpose in the first place. And also, I think in the UK context, the other element that should be taken into consideration is just that, I mean, at least that I thought about myself when I was going through this, is the lack of a First Amendment to kind of really provide a bedrock sense that that would make it illegal, to discriminate against people for their points of view. I think it's particularly dangerous in that context. Although, of course, the First Amendment's being eroded in all kinds of ways in the US too. So, but I think that creates that. Maybe that's, I would say that, the IHRA in general kind of globally had a very bad effect on Palestinian activism everywhere, but in the UK, I think in university context, like it's potentially, at least, or chronologically, is the worst, I would say, at the beginning at least, and maybe it's spreading. And it's partly, I think, because of that, the tendency to kind of cave into bureaucracy, lack of a internalized sense of free speech right, and then the IHRA kind of coming in and making everything even worse.
And I mean, I don't want to get off on a complicated tangent, but this also comes in the UK on the context of the Corbyn chaos and kerfuffle, the words I'm trying to come up with, around anti-Semitism and the Labour Party and accusations and witch hunts and all of that. So, I mean, it's sort of like it was fertile ground, I think, for this move towards academia. And for folks who are not watching the UK, we're witnessing right now a move for legislation, for actual, well, I think it's advancing rather quickly. This is legislation it's legislation to prohibit local councils and other government bodies from boycotting Israel or settlements. And it's a fascinating piece of legislation because it actually it singles out Israel Palestine as the issue on which it can't ever be really overturned or challenged, and it has very broad free speech implications for just people showing up and expressing opinions. And it also does erode the right to boycott more broadly for everything, which is, of course, maybe why some people will care about it. But that looks like it's advancing pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's remarkable how successful it's been, unfortunately. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that, and I will say that that is directly linked to IHRA in the sense
Mhm.
that the, anti-BDS and boycott being synonymous with anti-Semitism and all of that. It's all part and parcel. I want to come back. I mean, looking at IHRA more broadly, and I want to refer to some of your articles, because every time you write anything, I'm like, yes, you say things very, very well, very clearly. You sum up a lot of complex ideas in ways that I think are incredibly effective. So, and I follow this stuff obviously on my side of the pond. I follow Congress very carefully. There was recently a kerfuffle with Congress because a congresswoman, Jayapal, was at Netroots, and she criticized Israel, and immediately there was this outbreak of outrage at her, bipartisan, including calling her an anti-Semite. She ended up walking it back somewhat, but it fed the nastiness in Congress that accuses progressives of being anti-Semitic because they criticize Israel. And you, writing from the other side of the pond, observed, you wrote a great article entitled "Speaking the Truth About Israel in Congress." There'll be a link to that. And you observed, I'm going to quote this: "If we accept the rhetorical turn that has dominated US public discourse around Israel since the advent of the IHRA definition, we are forced to choose between acknowledging Palestinians' point of view and being accused of anti-Semitism. This is an unsustainable and unacceptable opposition that follows logically from definitions of racism that prioritize feelings over material conditions. Everyone has the right to be offended, but no one has the right not to be offended or to translate their feelings of offense into an unequivocal demonstration of racism." So I want you to unpack that a little bit. And talk about this extremely problematic intellectual framing that, in effect, I would say, maybe oversimplistically, it almost requires that we all be anti-Palestinian in order to not be called anti-Semitic.
Yes, I would say even anti-Palestinian, or potentially just kind of utterly oblivious of the existence of Palestinians. I feel that's kind of where the title for my book comes from, because that's what I noticed happening in the UK. Every controversy about Israel, kind of from the beginning, is in the university context, just automatically excluded Palestinian perspectives. Also, by the way, these hearings in Parliament regarding the BDS bill didn't have any Palestinians offering they weren't invited. Of course, they had opinions, and they are impacted by this legislation.
I agree. Maybe it's a semantic distinction. I would argue that asking people to be oblivious to or indifferent to the suffering of people is a
Right.
form of
Oh, yeah.
racism. So, like, I think we're
No,
saying
you're
the same
right.
thing in different words.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree. It's kind of a step along the way. Yes, absolutely. It is ultimately, it comes down to the same thing. There's no question about it. But I guess I'm just interested in kind of the process through which that hatred, anti-Palestinian position kind of becomes feasible, and it has to involve erasure and right, not even oblivion, because that implies like passivity, but yeah, something kind of active erasure. And yes, I witness that happening, am witnessing it happening time and again in the UK in the context of my situation as well. It was very interesting that the panel that reviewed my article, and which decided it was not anti-Semitic, one thing that they misinterpreted it, and they said it was written in the United States, which it wasn't, erasing the fact that it was written in Palestine, even though I referenced it being written in Palestine in the article itself. And yes, then there's the BDS parliament hearings that are not allowing Palestinians to speak. There's the fact that every time there's a controversy about Israel, anti-Israel activism in UK universities, it is seen as an issue for the Jewish societies, but not the Palestinian societies. That's happening again and again and again. So it's presented as an issue that, that's the impact, the kind of cumulative effect of all of these defending oneself against these accusations as well, is that one becomes so enwrapped in kind of debating what anti-Semitism is and is not, but the Palestinian question is obscured from view.
Yeah, I was really struck by this paragraph. I in the United States, we had last week in Pennsylvania, there was the Palestine Rights Conference, and Foundation for Middle East Peace was a proud supporter of that. I attended it. It was a remarkable event. It felt really privileged for the parts that I was able to attend. If you looked at the discourse around it, it was so openly racist against Palestinians and so intolerant. And it goes back to something you said in the earlier article about, the feelings. It's like, this makes us uncomfortable and therefore it's anti-Semitism. And if you don't agree with that, you're an anti-Semite. There's no gray area in this at all for even thinking differently. I want to go back to the definition itself, and I've spent so much time sucked into the IHRA conversation, and I get a little bit glib sometime, but the advocates of the IHRA definition are fond of saying you have to define it to fight it, right? Define it to fight it. And I have argued, in fact, I have a bookmarked tweet, or I should say a post on X, which says that what they really mean is you have to define all meaningful criticism of Israel, its policies, and Zionism as anti-Semitism in order to fight it, because you can't win the arguments any other way, which I think is true. At the same time, the question of how you define anti-Semitism is a real one, and especially in an era of surging hatred, incitement, threats, violence, discrimination against people because they are Jewish, which is what most of us have always thought of as anti-Semitism. And it's actually how the Biden administration defined it in their anti-Semitism strategy. Good for them. You took on this question specifically head on in a recent article entitled "Why We All Need a More Precise, Practical Definition of Anti-Semitism." And you took it on in such a thoughtful way in this article. I want you to talk about what, in your view, is a more precise and practical definition of anti-Semitism. What does that involve, and what do we need to shift in our thinking to get there?
Sure. So also I want to mention, I'll answer that question in very specific ways, but I want to mention my favorite chapter in the Erasing Palestine book that in a sense gives an answer to that question, but from a different period. So I have a chapter about Leon Abram, who was a wonderful kind of discovery I made while I was doing the research for the book, who offered not just a definition, but a very ambitious study of anti-Semitism while he was living in Nazi-occupied Belgium. And he is now, of course, I'm not saying that that's the solution to what the problems we face today, but I just want to flag people because I do think that we need historical awareness. It's not always been the same. There needs to be some awareness of not just before Israel, what was anti-Semitism and so forth. But in practical terms, I think the first move I would make, and this is something I think people like Ken Stern would agree with as well, is distinguishing between like hate crimes and then racist sentiment, right? Because the approach to those things in whatever kind of world one is living in, it isn't logical that they would be identical, right? There are things that are in danger of people's safety, like murder, arson, that obviously need to be penalized to the fullest extent of the law. And when those have an element of anti-Semitism or racism, that does make it worse. And I think it's entirely appropriate to use anti-Semitism, to use in that definition of anti-Semitism in that context to intensify the criminal penalties for things that are actually crimes in the first place, right? But then I think we all know that there are a lot of idiots out there in the world, and it doesn't work to just criminalize everything that's wrong and unethical and that we need to fight against. And so that I think the kind of strategies and solutions for the kind of, what can we say, implicit, insidious anti-Semitism that we find in ideas and words, which is there's no question it's proliferating. There's no question it's a problem. But I'm not so convinced that the solution to that is a legal one, in the sense, we can't put them all in prison. So I think that approach requires that's where we need things like historical awareness, education, and yeah. So I think just a diversified approach. There's no one size fits all. Like, you can't deal with Holocaust denial in the same way as you can deal with arson, or like it just doesn't fit into this rubric, and you can't mix it up with the political agendas either. So I think I think that distinction is kind of the key to moving forward with the conversation, and actually challenging anti-Semitism, is making that distinction between hate crimes and where anti-Semitism is implicated in that, and anti-Semitic racism, which should be challenged at all levels, through education and debate.
So I guess I have another question for you, which relates directly to this, and I'd planned this to be my last question, but it may not be because I really want to keep on you out on this. So you talk about the more precise definition. What you mentioned sort of in passing implied is this is separate from the politicized definition, right? So that presupposes that you found a way to disentangle the politicized, making it about Israel and pushing back speech. On the Jayapal article, I left out the part which was the hook for your quote in that article about Congress was Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the congresswoman from Florida, talking about how much it hurt her hearing these words that the congresswoman said, and this mistaking feeling hurt for meaning that the other person's language is automatically anti-Semitic or racist or has to be shut down. You also talk about the structural inequities, which I'd love to have you talk a little bit about. In fact, before I get to my last question, I want you to talk about the idea of how the concept of structural inequities comes into what should be a meaningful understanding of free speech and limits on free speech and how that relates to anti-Semitism and free speech around Palestinian freedom.
Yes. And I think that brings us back to a couple of your earlier questions as well, like the limitations of the IHRA definition. So another thing I haven't quite said yet, but really needs to be said, is that I think one of the perhaps the biggest problem, there's so many, biggest problem with the IHRA definition is the way that it separates anti-Semitism from other kinds of racism. Because, while there are historical differences, I think anti-Semitism and racism in general have a much more in common than they have different. They are about hatred of groups, about stereotypes, about the persecution of people based on their identities, whether projected or whatever. And about
dehumanization. It's about dehumanizing the people who you feel are somehow their very existence and their historical narratives are intolerable to you.
Precisely. And I think the only way of understanding that is in relation to other kinds of hatred. It's not exclusive to any group. It's unfortunately the humans have done that throughout history to various kinds of people, and we need to look at it comparatively. And the IHRA definition does not do that. In fact, it prevents it, I would say. A material definition, a precise definition is one that finds that precision by comparing to other kinds of racisms. Maybe finds differences too, but at least it brings them into conversation. It looks at different kinds of dehumanizations. And you have to guide me back to your original question. I think I was getting there.
Structural inequities.
Yes, structural inequities. Yes. So I think that is precisely, so that is one thing, in addition to dehumanization, the creation of people, and I'm not just talking about 2023. I mean, this is throughout history, right? The separation of people into different classes, assigning them to certain kinds of jobs that are appropriate for them, right? That obviously has happened in the context of Jews with the history of anti-Semitism, but in India as well. Caste system, that's a very widespread phenomenon. So that, I think that gets at the heart of kind of what racism is, and also why racism persists, because obviously the people who are at the top of that hierarchy benefit from it. So that helps us explain the staying power. And I think it does so in a much more powerful way than this kind of bureaucratic adoption of a definition.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking, I tweeted out the other day, the Vicente Fox from Mexico had tweeted out, it was in response to someone had tweeted something about there's a woman candidate for president who's Jewish, looks like she could even win, and he had tweeted out in Spanish, Jewish and foreign. And I had just commented, according to the IHRA definition, that's not anti-Semitic, just kind of surreal, right? But if you criticize Israel, anti-Semite, it was just quite amazing. All right, so this is my final question to you, but it brings together a lot, and I want you really to take this in whatever direction you want. I first came across your work in 2020, long before this book and whatever. I found an article that you wrote in an academic journal called The Political Quarterly. It is a heavily researched and footnoted essay. Thank you for all of that. I love that. Entitled The IHRA Definition of Anti-Semitism, Denying Anti-Semitism by Erasing Palestinians. I suspect maybe it is the kernel for the book, even a little bit. I want to read what for me was the most just took my breath away excerpt. There are many. And here we go. quote, the working definition, which is what this used to be called, the working definition, it is, I mean, it's still called, it's the IHRA's working definition. The working definition is at once a proxy for and a symptom of a range of issues, including the failure of international law to hold Israel accountable for its crimes, the ineffectiveness and or indifference of international law towards the ongoing occupation of Palestine, and the unresolved legacies of the Holocaust. All of these issues are entangled into the working definition and help to account for the speed with which it has been adopted across Europe and the North. So these words for me just get right to the heart of the matter. Can you talk about this entanglement and writing in you're a historian, you're an academic, you've researched, these kinds of issues in other contexts. What does this entanglement mean for efforts to fight real anti-Semitism and to fight back against the weaponization? Because clearly this is more than just saying to people, oh, you're doing it wrong, or your language is imprecise. There's so much built into this unstated, right? That's behind the effort. And maybe people are even unaware of it. So how does one unpack that?
Right. So I think in terms of taking that forward, that what it show, I mean, in terms of moving beyond that kind of bind, that entanglement's a very powerful entanglement. And I think it was a very, if anything, the people who conceived of the IHRA definition, and they were very strategically minded, very, good thinkers about how to move a campaign forward. Because I think in a sense, the awareness of the injustice of the occupation was growing, and they found a very good tool to kind of make that conversation much, much more difficult. And I think what the effectiveness of that strategy, like the best response to it, is to maybe bring free speech back into leftist and pro-Palestinian activism. I think there is a sense in which it had kind of gone to the side. It's been seen as a value that is more for the right-wing people, to talk about cancel culture. Well, actually, I think it's a powerful tool, and I kind of discovered its power as someone who was accused, or I discovered being deprived of that right transformed me and changed me and made me much more politically aware, I think, of this issue in a way that I would never have become. And I think we need to find a way to use free speech to our advantage. I mean, it's a universally recognized value, but people tend to only recognize it, when it suits their own political agenda. And I think it can be much more, I think, a real effective kind of reckoning with it and reclaiming of it can actually be really helpful in challenging the dominance of the IHRA definition, because that is its greatest flaws, that it is really about censorship, although it doesn't acknowledge it as such. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of where it sends me, the direction in which it sends me.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great place to leave. It's hopeful, and that it gives us a constructive way to think about this. I will encourage people to read Rebecca's book. It is really, I have to say that writing something that is simultaneously so personal but makes such a universal, the values at stake are so universal, and I think you walk the line between the personal and universal just brilliantly. It's a really superb work, and also the articles, which I have relied on myself a great deal over the past few years. So thank you for that. With that, we are going to end this podcast. I have so much appreciate your time. Thank you, Rebecca, for joining me. Maybe we can do this again sometime. And if you're ever in Washington, I'd love to do this in person. I want to thank our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Make sure you check the website, www.fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other great content related to Palestine and Israel. Also, make sure you subscribe to the podcast to stay up to date. That's on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and you can, of course, watch the video version of this and see our smiling faces on the FMEP YouTube channel. And with that, I'm Lara Friedman, signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.
Great.